Welcome, everyone. The kickoff of our 2024 summer webinar series. My name is Sammy Anderson. I'm our marketing manager here at Softcrylic. Today, we're joined with our friends at Adobe, as well as JP, our digital analytics sensei, I believe we still go by. But today, we're talking all about the new identity or graph-based identity stitching with CJA. If you have any questions, comments throughout this presentation, please throw them in the chat or the Q&A feature. We do have a poll live, just kind of getting your pulse on where your team is at and what your experience is at with these tools. Any questions that we don't get a chance or run out of time to answer or cover throughout this presentation, they will be covered in our webinar blog, recapping everything that should go live late next week. Or always reach out to us, info@softcrylic.com, if you have any further questions for us, or Adobe will get you connected with the right people. But with that, I will pass it off to JP and we'll get started.
All right. Thank you, Sammy. So yes, this is the webinar on, what the new graph-based identity means for CJA. We'll do a quick round of intros here so you all know who you're listening to talk. So I'm John Paul. I lead the digital analytics practice at Softcrylic. Been doing this for about 15 years. My team really focuses on three key areas: strategy, implementation, and compliance. And then we just have a lot of deep expertise in both Adobe and Google, and just a lot of the other flavors of digital analytics tools. So I'll pass it over to Stephanie.
Thanks. So my name is Stephanie Burton. I'm an expert solutions consultant with Adobe, and I focus mostly on our data and insights products, so that's CJA, Adobe Smaller, and Adobe Analytics. And so what I do is I help our customers and our sales specialists and our potential clients really understand the value that these types of products offer, and just kind of determine what type of solution is going to help fit their needs and their challenges. And over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, Matt Thomas. I'm a product manager on the analytics team. My responsibility is around stitching, both on traditional analytics, also on CJA. So this topic is very important to me, as we'll be talking about graph-based stitching. I've been in the analytics space now for about 15 years, and excited to be part of this panel here.
Awesome. All right, so what are we going to be talking about? So I'll kick this off with why we think this is important. Just anecdotally, real quick, like when I heard about Stephanie's session at Summit, I had no idea about it, and I realized, not enough attention is being brought to this announcement. So we wanted to host this webinar so that we can get the word out, and also give an opportunity for people to ask questions, because I know I had a lot of questions, and I'll be asking a lot of those questions as Stephanie goes through the content. So this will be a little bit more of a conversation, and how Sammy said, put your questions in the chat. We'll try to address them maybe during the content or at the end. And if we don't, we'll hopefully put that in the recap blog post. So after that, after why we established why it's important to go through the, have a unified customer journey, Stephanie will go through the pros and cons of the current situation with field-based stitching. Then we'll try to list pros and cons of what graph-based stitching brings. Like I said earlier, we have a lot of deep expertise on the Google stack. I would like to compare kind of what we're seeing from Adobe to the capabilities of Google Analytics 4. And then, we'll go back into hopefully, seeing some data and like, what does this actually mean, right? What does this graph-based stitching unlock for you? So yeah, with that said, let's get into it. So why is this topic important, right? And the link down there in the footer, that's the link to Stephanie's Summit session. And I'll essentially summarize what she brought up in terms of why is this important. And 85% of customers, they say that the experience the customer provides, and we're all in the experience business, right? It's just as important as the product itself. And so when customers have friction, 96% of those customers are going to essentially stop purchasing with you, right? And so it's super important for us to understand all the different touch points and the friction. The only way for us to understand that is by having a fully stitched journey, right? And if we're able to do that, people are going to be happy customers recommend us, word of mouth, that's great. But also monetarily, companies who provide that consistent experience, they're able to charge 16% price premium over their goods and services. So, I don't know about you, but I would like to charge 16% premium over my goods and services. So with that said, I'm just going to go ahead and stop sharing. I'm going to let Stephanie start talking to us about, CJA, field-based stitching, and then we'll go through it.
Yeah, so let me get my slideshow going here. I'm actually going to start here. All right, are you guys still seeing the regular view?
We see the slide.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so, JV just mentioned that it's all about the customer experience, right? And we need to be able to view and analyze that holistic experience. But the challenge in doing that is that your customers are basically having an identity crisis according to your data, right? Because in one source of that data, you might have Bob here recognizing himself as Bob when he comes in the store, but then when he's interacting with you in the app or online, he's identifying himself as Robert at Adobe.com. And then when he calls into the Sports Center, he's recognized as 8675309, right? So there's no way to connect all of that data and really understand that experience when Bob's having this identity crisis, right? So you kind of have to find a way to resolve that. And the solution for doing that is identity resolution, right? That's how we solve for that problem. And what identity resolution is, it's basically where we take all of those different identities and we group or cluster them together to recognize a single person across all of those sources, right? Now, identity resolution is going to help your company have more accurate and complete information about their customers. Now, identity stitching is the part where we use those identifiers and we use those clusters to basically apply the identity that we need in order to integrate all of that data together, right? Because they all have different ones. Let's find the one that we need, put it everywhere we want it to be, and integrate that data in the proper sequential order of when all of those events happen across sources. So there are currently two ways that we can use stitching to help unify our data. So we're going to start with talking about field-based stitching. Now, this is something that has been in practice now for several years with CJA, so some of you are probably already doing it and very familiar. So how do we connect data in CJA, right? First, we have to actually create the connection, right? And if you're using the product, then this is probably familiar for you, right? This visual. We currently rely on a single person identity, the same type of identity to exist in every one of our event data sets that we're trying to connect, right? And that's great, but that's not the case, right? Sometimes we have to ETL or a little bit of data massaging. And so, we can't just assume that every data set is going to have that same ID available. Now, the biggest culprit that we tend to run into is digital data, right? Because in digital data, we might have a person ID or a way to identify somebody that is carried across to other channels, but most often we have a cookie ID, right? And that cookie ID is going to be a large majority of traffic because people are not always telling you who they are, right? Not right away. They're out there browsing. And so we try to accommodate for that with field-based stitching. So if we were to use the cookie ID to connect with other data in our CJA connection, we're going to miss out, right? Because we don't have any other data source that has that cookie ID, right? So we can't connect to offline data. We can't connect to Bob calling into the call center, right? But if we were to use the person ID as our connection, we're going to miss out on that huge chunk of unauthenticated traffic, right? And we still want to see that data. We still need to understand what our customers are experiencing in that environment. So field-based stitching is really how we get the best of both worlds. So how that works is when the data set gets stitched, it's basically creating a duplicate copy of that data set, okay? But this duplicate copy actually has new columns added to it. And those new columns are holding that stitched ID, okay? Now, what happens is we're going to populate that column with the best ID that we have available at the time. Now, for the most part, that's going to be your most persistent ID. So in this case, it would be your cookie ID, right? But that's only until an authentication occurs. Now, once somebody authenticates in that channel, then we switch and we recognize them by that person ID. So you can see here, we've got our cookie ID 123, but once that person logs in, we now recognize that it's Bob, right? And so now we can carry Bob forward and start using Bob to connect with the other data that we're bringing in. But the best part about field-based stitching is that we have this replay window, right? Where we can actually look back up to 7 days to restate all those hits now that we know who Bob is, right? Now that we have a better identification for him, we can go back and restate that data. So what this does is now we're able to connect both online and offline data, right? We're able to have our known and unknown data without missing anything, right? So if we were to take a real example of a real data set and see what happens, this is what you're going to see, right? So let's say we have this travel data set, digital data, and we've got our loyalty ID and our EC ID, right? Well, we can see the loyalty ID is only on about half of our rows, right? Only half of our events are going to have that. So by using field-based stitching, we're going to use that cookie ID, and we're going to put that cookie ID in our stitched ID column until we recognize that person has logged in. And then once that person is logged in, we're going to fill that stitched ID column with their recognized identity, right, with their loyalty ID. And then we're going to go ahead and apply both pre and post updates for that identification, right? Now, one thing that I want to call out here is that this is still relying on that authentication to happen within that same channel, right? It's relying on only the identities that you have available within this particular data set itself. And so the impact that this is going to have now on your reporting is, you know, originally we only had about half of our events or half of our rows tied to a loyalty ID, which you can eyeball that, right, with the data set itself. You apply field-based stitching, we were actually tie 92% of our events to that loyalty ID, right? So we're getting much closer to being able to connect more touch points together. So what are the pros and cons, right? Well, I don't like to think of it as pros and cons because everybody has scenarios. So I like to think of it as like benefits and then things you might want to consider. So in terms of benefits, right, the biggest one is being able to get both that known and unknown data together, right? And that gives you the ability to still unify with offline data whenever possible, right? It's also going to support shared devices because we have that timestamp information in those data sets, right? Your attribution is getting carried across devices. It's getting carried across channels. If somebody searches on desktop and then purchases something in an app or even in store, you can carry that attribution of that search all the way through to where the transaction happened. And then the biggest benefit here, I think, is the restatement of the data, right? That's a big one, being able to look backwards and rekey to the proper association of identities once that's been noted. Things to consider, data hygiene, right? There are some little things here and there like case sensitivity, right? You want to have your IDs on a case sensitive format because that's going to create some messiness if somebody, comes in as Bob capital B-O-B and then Bob lowercase b-o-b, right? That's not going to reconcile. So you want to have a little bit of data hygiene in there. Another thing to consider is that this is limited to identities within that single data set, right? So you're also going to rely on that authentication to occur within that same data set. And this is also going to assume that every other source of data that you want to connect to is going to have that same golden ID base, right? You're going to assume that that same person ID is in every other data set that you need. But in reality, that's not always the case, right? There's a lot of times where companies have other sources of data that they can't bring in because they don't have that right ID. And that's either sitting on the shelf, right, not getting used and not getting leveraged for the customer experience. Or maybe they're doing a lot of work, right? They're doing a lot of ETL work to get that identity in place, and it's causing a lot of resource intensive time and a lot of latency and freshness in the data as well. Any questions on field-based stitching from you guys before I move on to how we reconcile for those extra data sets?
There's a question in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee, mysterious person. So can an implementation engineer implement this without support from an Adobe engineer? And I mean, I think the answer is yes, but you still, you need to be able to submit a ticket, right, through customer support today.
Yeah. So basically, Adobe's doing the heavy work for you. When you
Yeah.
send something to be stitched, you tell us, you submit a ticket to tell us what are the IDs that we're going to use as our reference points, right? And then Adobe sets up the process for the stitching to happen. So that all happens on our end. Yeah.
Great. And I mean, with a lot of, oh, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
I will add that's for the moment, right? The end goal is to have this be a little bit more self-service.
Mhm.
So we hear you, and we do want you to do a little bit more self-service on this front.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like,
so
a lot of
thinking
features,
a UI might be in the works in the future.
Yeah, a lot of features start that way, right? Where you guys, client care has to enable, and then eventually UI comes in. I remember server-side forwarding for Audience Manager was like that. So many things like that. So we can expect a UI soon. My question, what was my question? I had a question. Yeah, in terms of the limitations, right? So I just want to highlight that you did a good job here highlighting it, but like you need to be authenticated, right? Every data set that you have, you have to be able to identify the person with a customer ID or unique ID. And any event that they do, they need to be able to, have that ID associated to it, right? And just on the digital side of that data sets, you can go back to a maximum of only 7 days, right? Like if they visited before a year ago or whatever, how long ago, maybe a year's too long, but like a month ago, that piece is not, you can't replay, right?
Right. That's pretty long.
That long. Okay. Yeah, it's pretty long. So there's some limitations. Let's talk about graph-based.
Yeah.
Next to, I have another question, but I want to leave it until after this.
Okay.
Yeah.
You got it. Okay. So similar to how field-based stitching works, graph-based stitching also generates a copy of that data set, right? And it's going to append new columns for the stitched ID and the stitched ID namespace, which is just telling you what type of ID value that is. And it also is going to have replay options as well, right? So restating that data. But the difference here is that if you look at that stitched ID namespace, you see email, right? But there's no email in this original web data set. And that's because we're making a reference now outside of this particular data set to the identity graph, right? So remember the identity resolution, we talked about this clustering of IDs, creating a graph. We're referencing that to be able to identify this person now. And the other benefit here is that you don't have to wait for this authentication to happen online, right? You can see in these first few rows, I'm able to use that cookie ID to go to the graph. And if the association is already there, then I can go ahead and pull in that email, right? And again, compared to field-based stitching, that means I'm not relying on them to authenticate online. They just have to authenticate somewhere and make those associations made in the graph, right? So let's get into the details of how this actually works. So we know in reality that our data sources look a little more like this, right? Every channel is going to use a different way to recognize customers, and some might have a little overlap here and there. But even with field-based stitching, there's no way to connect the rest of these sources together, right? So let's walk through an example from end to end, okay? So in this travel example, we've got 5 different event data sets across the top, and then a profile data set on the bottom, right? So you can see we've got web data that's passing in, a cookie ID, and a loyalty ID. Well, then we also have call center data that's introducing a new way to recognize customers, their phone number. We've got survey data introducing an email as a way to recognize customers. You've got your transactional data where you can recognize them by phone or email, and so on, right? But in its current state, there's no way that we can connect all 5 of these events together, right? There's no way to see a customer's experience through all of these channels in the way it's currently set up. So I'm going to use that stitched ID capability, but this time I need to make that reference outside of any single data set. So let's first talk about how we get that graph created, right? Where do we get this from? So as you're ingesting those 5 data sets or whatever data sets you have, as you're ingesting those into platform, You see, we've got all of our data sets here on this left image, right? We're ingesting all of that. Well, while we're doing that, we're going to define which fields in that data are considered an identity, right? Some of them are common, some of them might be unique to your company. And so then we end up with a list of identities on the right, okay? Now what's happening is, as that data is coming in, those identities are getting built into that graph, right? It's recognizing, hey, this is the identity, let's go put it in this graph and start creating our cluster for this customer, right? So I'm gonna show you how that graph builds. We've got it started here, and I've pulled in my my web digital data, it looks like first, tied to loyalty ID, right? But now, as this toggle is going to move, you're going to see that when I ingest each additional data source, it's making new connections. I pull in voice of customer, it's got ECID and email connection. Then call center comes in, and now I can connect call and loyalty, or phone number and loyalty. And then my CRM data comes in, and it connects my email and my phone number, right? And so now, as this data is coming in, it's always updating the graph, and it's making these connections for you, anything that you deem as an identity, right? Now, one thing I want to call out that I think is not really as well known as I thought it would be is that if you already have CDP, if you're already using CJA, and you're familiar with the graph, this is that graph. It is one graph, the same graph for all the solutions, and now CJA just has the ability to leverage that, right? So that's going to give us this benefit of being able to have a more consistent view of your customer across all of these different solutions that you're using.
So that is what I was gonna, ask in the last field-based stitching is, people who have AEP, at least in my experience, I was using AEP and I would see this. I expected CJA to have this as well by default, and it did not. And that was a big shock for me. I was like, oh my God, what? CJA doesn't do this by default? Like, how is this thing? But now, I mean, what we're talking about now is literally that. Like CJA has this by default, right? Or, well, maybe not by default. You need to enable it, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
which is great.
It's a lot more work to make it happen. So than I think you realize, right? So that's why it took us some time to make sure our engineers were working hard to get it all in place, working effectively, make it make sense, right?
Yeah.
But your sentiment, I'm sure, is shared.
Exactly. Yeah, no, there's some blogs out there that when I read, they're being shared a lot around this and how do you solve this, stitching issue. And I mean, to be fair, right? Like you can solve the stitching yourself. Like if you can have a graph-based, database, you can have an engineer do that, but that's going to require an engineer, right?
It's
going to take time.
It's not cost effective. It's not ideal, but
CJA has it for you. That's awesome.
Finally. Okay, so now that we have the graph, right, how do we use that graph to get the IDs that we need for connecting all this data together, right? So first we have to decide what data do we even want to connect and how do we want to connect it, right? What data do we need to analyze and how do we get it? How do we want to connect it? So how we want to connect it is what is the person ID that you want to use for connecting all this together? Sometimes we'll refer to this as the golden ID, right? And when I say that, I want you to think of the golden ID as your most ubiquitous, most durable first-party ID path, right? Something that you will have across as many sources of data as you can. In this case, I'm going to use email for those 5 data sets that we've created. Now, the other question is, what data do you want to bring in? Well, I want to bring all of it, right? But I only have 3 of those data sets that have an email available, right? So I can build my connection with just those 3, but I'm missing 2 really critical sources, right? My call center data and my web data are pretty significant. I can't just leave that part of the experience out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those 2 data sets and I'm going to submit them to be stitched, right? Now remember, that's going to create a duplicate copy with a new stitched column. So what I'm doing is I'm going to use the identifiers that I have available in each of those sources to find a match in the book. So for example, with my web data here, I've got my ECID and sometimes I might have a loyalty ID. But my ECID is the most persistent in that source. So I'm going to use my ECID. I'm going to go look over to the graph and I'm going to say, okay, well, for my ECID 123, is there an email associated to that graph? If yes, great, got a match. I'm going to put that in my new stitched ID column. If not, I'm going to keep it as my ECID until an email becomes available, right? Now, what happens is you end up with those 2 new copies of your data sets, right, for the stitched versions. And now I can actually build that connection, right? I have my email for my voice of the customer CRM and CFAC data, but now I can still pull in my web and call center data, and it's going to use an email to stitch everything together when available, right? But it's not going to make me lose out on any rows that don't have an email yet, right? Now, again, the authentication can happen in any one of those sources. I don't have to wait for somebody to give their loyalty ID online and then use that to try to find an email. As long as the association is in the graph, it comes in the graph from any one of those sources, I can use that, right? So what does that look like in the actual UI, right? Now we understand how the concept works. The next question I get from customers is, well, how do I actually set that up? Like, what does my connection look like when I'm in the builder, right? So this is what it looks like. You'll see here, I'm pulling in my 5 data sets on the left. I've got my 3 original data sets that already have an email, but then for the web and call center, you'll see that I'm pulling in the stitched copy that has been created, okay? And then over here on the right, you'll see what ID I'm using as my choice to connect all that data together, right? The ones that have email, that's going to be the golden ID. And then the other ones, I'm going to use whatever's in that stitched ID column to connect all that data together. And again, sometimes I feel like when you say connect, you just think of like mushing all of it together, but it's really integrating all of that data, right? It's integrating every single row where it needs to be in the order of occurrence and when that action happens, which is really, I think, one of the key differentiators of CJA compared to some other BI tools. So, all right, so let's take another look at what is happening within the data set itself, right? This is going to look really familiar. We've got our original data set, our web data, right? We've got our ECID and our loyalty ID. Again, that ECID is the most persistent. So use that to go have my stitched data set created. I'm going to use that as my lookup. And then I get my 2 new columns added within the data set where it's going to pull in my email when available. It's looking to that graph to see if there's one available. If not, then it would have just left the ECID in that column. So you might be thinking, how is this different, right? Because I think Matt had mentioned that he is responsible for stitching across all the solutions, including analytics, right? Which you had in the past. Some ultimate customers might be doing cross-device analytics as well. The biggest differentiator is obviously omnichannel, right? In CJA, you can pull in all of those other types of sources, whereas in analytics with cross-device, you're still limited to just your digital data. Okay, so that's the biggest differentiator. But what about when you have a customer or a client that is just using CJA for digital data right now, right? Maybe they're just started migrating over, or they're new to the system, or they're standing it up CJA for bypass analytics. Well, if you're just looking at digital data, there's still some pretty significant differences. One, in cross-device analytics, you have to have a global report suite already. You need to have your device data already combined in one report suite, whereas CJA, you don't have to, right? We can make that, merge that data together. The other biggest one is that the report time processing that happens on a virtual report suite, which is what's used for cross-device, there are limitations to that CJA doesn't have. So virtual report suites, you're going to run into limitations with CJA around marketing channels won't be available, A4T data won't be available, can't really do data feeds, can't pull in customer attributes, and then there's a whole series of other dimensions and metrics that are not available in that type of report suite, right? So you're limiting yourself in the type of data that you have available to analyze in that cross-device analysis versus CJA, where you will have the ability to look at those things. Matt, is there anything else significant that I've maybe overlooked? It's been a long time since I've even used cross-device analytics.
No, I think you spoke to all the limitations perfectly.
Okay.
So I have a question here. So cross-device analytics, so people may be using that today. You can think of that, or would it be accurate of saying, like, can you think of that as a digital field-based stitching solution just for digital data sets that you own?
Yeah, that's a good way of couching it. I think the problem is a lot of people say cross-channel analysis, and they conflate
Mhm.
cross-device analytics with cross-channel analysis, and the two are different, right? Cross-device analytics is a specific functionality that happens within analytics. It's single channel, and it's kind of has these limitations based on report time processing. And so that's kind of the key difference there. Cross-channel analysis is really the bread and butter of what CJA does natively. And then you add a little salt and pepper of graph-based stitching on there, and you just make that experience that much better.
Okay, I see. So yeah, now I see the kind of the evolution, right? It's like you had ECID, right, as your initial identifier. Now, then you had like your cross-device using a user ID to join, that joins different devices into one, but not necessarily across your different touch points, right? The different channels.
Yeah.
CJA does channels, but then that had a limitation that you needed to be authenticated in every of your data set or every of your channel. And now it's across channel without having to be authenticated, right? As long as there's an ID that links them at any point in their journey, right? Like
In any
it's
channel, yeah.
in any channel. Like, awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. And I have another question here. So cross-device analytics, you need a single report suite. So you need to have that global report suite, right? Which if you're a company that has many websites and a lot of traffic, you're going to start hitting limitations on the report suite level from a low traffic perspective, cardinal, unique values in one dimension and things like that. Customer journey analytics, you don't have to have a global report suite, right? That's all in CJ. That's how you establish your connection, right? It's no limitations at that
And
point.
row level access, right? So you don't have that cardinality.
Exactly. Yeah, that's great. Cool. Back to you, Stephanie. Wait, there's a couple
I'll
questions.
kind of wrap this up before passing it back to you to talk about GA4, just kind of thinking about the benefits and considerations of graph-based stitching. So obviously the key benefits, right? You have that holistic view of your customer's experience across channels. You have better identification of customers as a whole, but you have more ways to make that recognition happen, right? And that's a big data there. And then of course, just being able to join more sources of data together that maybe previously were not something that you could easily do, right? Something that you could easily pull in without any extra effort. And then, of course, thinking with the other app services, right? Having that same graph be used to recognize a person across the solution. Those, I think, are the biggest benefits to call out for now. But some things that you do want to consider, right? It does not support shared devices initially, right? Not upon the first release, but I do believe there will be some fast follow-up developments that hopefully will accommodate that. It doesn't support identity maps. So something that I remember running into on the consulting side with field-based stitching was we would get, a great web SDK implementation, we're all good to go, but then the ECID is in the identity map. It's like, well, we can't use that for stitching. So it was a lot of work to remind people to make sure you copy that into its own field, right? Into a separate field. So that still carries through with graph-based stitching as well. Make sure that those identities are in their own field, not just the identity map.
That's interesting. I did not know that. So big highlight on that. You need to have identity map data element, but also you need to send it to another namespace. The same ECID.
Yeah.
It's a good tip.
And let me just jump in here. And I know that is a point of frustration for quite a few of our customers who maybe have a long-standing run of data where it is in the identity map. And so moving it into a field would almost be in a going forward only basis, and they wouldn't want to do that. There are ways to kind of mitigate that, but from the product team, we do plan on adding support for that. It's near close on our roadmap, right? We're evaluating it right now, so that's something that we're considering.
Okay, but as an immediate next step for anybody in this call that has AP and Web SDK, copy your ECID to another namespace.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
We do have some limitations that we inherit, right, from the user identity service. So like 50 IDs per graph, right? Usually that's not really an issue unless you have a lot of kiosk data or things like that. And then you really can only choose one golden ID to reference, right, as for your stitching. So think of this like you wouldn't really be able to create a connection on email plus the connection on, phone plus connection on, loyalty ID, and then have stitched versions for every single one of those, right? You got to pick one to focus on as your golden ID and use that for your stitch data. Plus, you probably wouldn't want to have all of those stitch copies anyway. That's going to be pretty a lot of data and a lot of cost.
All right.
Yeah, so JP, like you mentioned, you have a little bit more familiarity with Google Analytics.
Yes.
You want to talk a little bit about how graph-based stitching compares there?
Yes, let's do that. And I know there are some questions in the Q&A. We have 20 minutes. I want to go through, what I have to say, and then, I want Stephanie also. You have some more content to share afterwards, or
Yeah.
are you done? You do? All right, great.
Recording. Yeah.
Excellent. So let's go through that. Right. So some people, I haven't seen the poll results. I don't know if we can see that. Am I able to see the poll results here? Probably. I don't know. I don't know how many people are using GA4 in this call, but kind of normal reaction for me as an expert on both is, all right, how does this compare to GA4, right? So, well, first, let's understand, how does GA4 do identity, right? So there's this thing called reporting identity in GA4 that it helps you, it kind of determines how GA4 counts users and sessions, right? And there these, you typically choose this thing, this option called blended. I won't go into that too much, but essentially it kind of uses a prioritized sequence on which one of these IDs GA4 uses to identify a single person. And this user ID is what enables you to do cross-device linking, right? And so if you have a web and you have an app, you authenticate, you have the same user ID, person on the web and then the app get joined together, right? That's CDA. You can also, if you don't have your own user ID, Google has this cool thing called Google Signals, but then it's kind of their own thing and you don't have access to that ID, right? You can also upload offline attributes of your users, right, into GA4. This is recently available this April. You could do that with Adobe back in the Adobe Analytics only days with customer attributes. That's been available since 2015. So it's like a 9-year difference, which is wild. But then those are just attributes, right? Those are not data sets. They're not cross-channel, linkages. So, if I can show my pretty elementary, boxes and lines here to explain, on the GA4 side, really, like, how does GA4 do identity? I think it summarizes to it doesn't in general, right? Like, you have to do it in BigQuery. That's like the tagline, I would say, of GA4 recently is you have to do it in BigQuery, right? Because if you look at the way it works in GA4 itself, if you have your web, you have your app, you have mobile web even, you have these device IDs. Yes, you can join them with the user ID. Again, that's the equivalent to CDA. You can do the same with non-digital sources through data import, but these are not cross-channel attribution, right? The way that or cross-channel stitching, sorry, the way that Matt explained earlier. And that's, I think that's a good way for me to understand it too, right? It's cross-device versus cross-channel. So yeah, again, you can do it in BigQuery if you have an engineer, if you have the skill set, and if you have the budget to maintain that. To be fair with GA and to be fair with any other digital solution out there. But I think that, where CJA comes into play is, giving that power back to the marketers, right? And that time to insight is a lot quicker because you don't have to rely on a backlog of data engineers and all that, right, to prioritize your request. So yeah, if there's anyone in the audience that knows more about GA4, would love to hear, what you guys have to say about how GA4 does identity. But yeah, in short, CJA with graph-based identity especially kind of really seems to solve a lot of the use cases. On GA4, you can do a lot of the digital side of things very well. But once you go across channels, you have to do it in BigQuery. Do you guys have any questions on that? Stephanie and Matt? No, you're good? All right, cool. Great. So now I want to pass it back to, am I still sharing my screen? Here. Let me stop sharing. Yeah, there we go. Pass it back to Stephanie to show us a little bit more about what CJA graph-based stitching unlocks inside Workspace. Is that what you're going to show us?
I am going to show you that. I just gotta find this here. Oh, hang on. Let me get to the right slide down here. I assume you see the PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let me switch it to. Okay, well, we'll just go this way. Okay, so first and foremost is what is the impact on our reporting, right? There's a few different areas. The biggest one that I think we want to highlight first is just the identification rates, right? Being able to identify your customers and improving that percentage of authentication in your reporting, right? Now, the more ways that you can recognize a customer, the more you're inevitably going to have your identification rates go up, right? Now, by how much? That's entirely dependent on your data, right? It's entirely dependent on your data, your sources that you're connecting, your authentication rates across those sources, and what type of associations you can make. But to kind of just highlight how the calculation would work.
Did we lose Stephanie?
Yeah, I think so.
I love the moment when we lost her. To show how it works. Stops.
But once I was able to use graph-based stitching.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, my internet connection is unstable. That's wonderful. Once I was able to turn on graph-based stitching, now I'm able to tie a lot more of my data to an email, regardless of where I'm getting that email from, right? As long as it's in the graph. So that I think is one of the biggest call out to really showcase. And then of course, the unlocking value of being able to bring in that data together, right? So before graph-based stitching, you would have really only truly integrate 3 of those sources together, right? But for graph-based stitching, not only was I able to bring all 5 together, but more significantly, I was able to bring in 2 data sets that don't natively have an email in, and still get that applied and have them connected to my data. And then this is all about customer experience, right? So we're trying to improve the customer experience. That's the main focus for companies these days. So being able to visualize what your customer is going through, what their journey looks like, that's crucial, right? Before graph-based stitching, if I only had those 3 sources of data in my connection, this is what my customer experience would look like to me, right? Now, what's troubling here is that, great, I know that they had a transaction in CRM, and then they submitted a survey. If that survey was bad, I can't tell you why. I can't tell you what made it bad or good, right? Because I don't know what's happening in those touch points in between. I don't have any information about what is causing, what type of causation is happening between those events. Now, there are some clients that are pulling in all of those sources together for a single reporting interface. It's not uncommon. And that's one thing when you're looking at high-level numbers, but it's another thing when you're really trying to analyze a customer's experience, right? So when you start to break that out into call-outs, a lot of breakage, right? You get a lot of breakage points, and there's no way in this view to really find where friction is happening. There's no way to know where you need to improve the experience or put in any sort of effort on marketing or optimization to change the experience for your customer, right? So once you apply graph-based stitching and you're able to pull all those touch points together and you're able to merge all of the, fully integrate all those experiences, now you can more accurately understand what experience your customer is having. You can more accurately go in and know where to focus your efforts, know where to put in your optimization and marketing campaigns, and you can accurately measure the impact, right? You can know whether or not it's working and where you need to revisit. So I think just being able to see the flow of those touch points by having that identifier there to connect them is really going to change, I think, the perspective of a lot of clients and being able to really understand how to change the experience for a customer. So
This view right here, for the last
Mhm.
10 years, hearing the word customer journey analytics, not the product that you guys have, but the customer journey. I want to know what the customer journey is. Everybody always says, I want to know what the customer is. I would always imagine something like this, but I
Yeah.
could never, it was very rare to actually see it. Here it is, finally.
Yeah, there it is. It was all about filling in the identity gaps to make this happen, right? And now we have a way to do that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So are we now at Q&A time?
I think so. Yep.
Excellent. So there's one question here, not in this Q&A, but we have some Softcrylic folks, and so they're pinging me on Teams, asking me questions. But the question is, does graph-based stitching also have a limitation of 7-day replay window once that linkage gets established? I think the answer is no, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, great question. It is not a limitation anymore. It is dependent on, so we have 2 additional flavors now we offer. We have a 14-day and a 30-day look back that are run weekly. So like our 7-day that's run weekly, it'll, instead of being 7 days, it'll be 14 or 30 days.
Okay.
So that is an option.
What drives
And
that limitation, if I can ask?
All
right, go ahead.
Just before I answer that, but if I could, I would love to get anyone's feedback on if they would want longer look back windows than that. That's kind of where we settled based on conversations I've had with customers, but I'd love to hear any other use cases where they would want maybe infinite or a year or something longer than 30 days. So, chat in or ping me afterwards and let me know. I'd love to hear that.
Okay.
To answer your question though, what's driving that mainly is costs.
Okay.
If you think about how much data we're talking about, replaying 1 day of data and truing that up or fixing it up and aligning it to the right identity, it's only 1 day of data. How much can that be? It's still a lot in some cases for some of our customers, but 7 days, we even more data. Now at 30 days, we could be playing, I don't know, replaying billions of rows of data and correcting it. And that can be costly over time.
Right. Makes sense. That's fair.
Yeah.
Here's one question. Alex Barnes. Alex, you were a late joiner. That's why you asked this question. But when does graph-based stitching release?
Yeah, and luckily I have an answer for that as well. It is going to release at the end of this month. We are excited about that. And looking at your question as well, we did have an alpha program that we did with a couple of customers earlier in the year. And so this will be a GA release at the end of this month.
Nice. So straight to production, end of the month.
Yep. Yeah. I will caveat that with, we did also release a few new pricing tiers, SKUs. So we do have CJA Select, Prime, and Ultimate. This will be going to Prime and Ultimate tiers.
Prime and Ultimate. Makes sense. All right. Do you guys have any preference on which one to answer, or should I just go one from the top? We still have about 8 minutes left.
Go from the
I'll
top.
go from the top.
Questions right now.
All right. So curious about refresh cadence. Does the graph stitching need to be manually requested, or is it always on, where the ID is automatically updated when new data becomes available? I think you answered that via another way, Matt. It's every week, but you have to first enable it via customer support, right?
Yes and no. So the
Okay.
graph is an always an ever-changing state, right? As new identities come in, it gets augmented and updated. We get a snapshot of that every 15 minutes. So that's what we use when we take the key that's in our data set, we'll call it ECID, and we kind of do that lookup, give me back the email address. The freshness of that graph snapshot is every 15 minutes. And
Well,
some might say, well, that's too slow, that's not enough. But if you think about it, the replay will fix anything that we don't catch in between those times, right? If we have a 30-day look back, who cares if it's every 15 minutes? We'll go back and true up that data eventually over the course of those replay windows.
all right. Then another one from Alex. What is your recommendation for folks using identity map for the data set they want to switch and who do not have an individual ID namespace being populated who want to use the feature? So then implement one and just get data going forward, data distiller to copy it from ID map to a dedicated ID namespace field to get data retroactively. Okay, very technical, but I think the answer to this is, well, definitely copy your ECID to another identity namespace so that you can get access to it. It'll be going forward only. And then I don't know if you guys want to add anything else to that.
I would
You wanna
defer to
talk-
Stephanie. I think you've done this a couple times with customers, right?
Yes, I have. It largely depends, right, on if at the point if you start collecting that in its own field day now, right? By the time that you would be able to set up graph-based stitching, will you have enough of that data, right? That you would be fine. You might, right? If it's like a month or two down the road that you finally get around to implementing it. Now, if you want that historical data, sure, use data distiller. We can hydrate the graph. But I think as long as you kind of set it up now, then by the time that you would actually implement graph-based stitching, you probably have enough data, depending on how much traffic you have.
Right. Okay. Yeah, we would have to look at your individual case, but you know,
Yeah.
very
And like,
minimum, start copying that.
You know, what's your sales cycle like? What's your standard cadence like? Things like that will come into play.
All right. And then we have two comments on the look back. The first one is 30 or 15 is much better than current. So that's great. Awesome. And the other one is on the travel industry because it can be, spread out, the consideration events. Longer windows would be helpful, but then, of course, it would probably come at a higher cost as well. But that makes sense. So if you're a prepared anonymous user to pay up, I think we can do that. Here I am talking as if I were Adobe, obviously not. Excellent. So, I really appreciate the time you guys have given us, Matt and Stephanie. I'm sure you're pretty busy. And I'm excited to see this feature live in production soon. And love everybody. I really enjoyed the Q&A that you all dropped your questions in the chat and all that. So yeah, I think, Sammy, we have more webinars coming in the future from Softcrylic. Do you have an idea?
Yes, we should have one towards the end of July and for sure mid-August, but TBD on topics and official dates. So follow us on LinkedIn and that'll be where you see it posted first.
Excellent. And Stephanie, Matt, any closing statements from you guys?
No, I think just be excited for the end of June.
End of
Thanks
June.
for the opportunity to talk with you guys. That's great.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Bye.